Hello, I'm Sarah Posner. I am an investigative journalist and author of the book Unholy, and I'm here today speaking with Brad Onishi, author of the book Preparing for War and the host of the excellent podcast Straight White American Jesus, otherwise known as SWAJ. Um, so, Brad, we're here today talking about Christian nationalism and democracy. And I thought a good way to start would be for you to just tell us what is Christian nationalism, so that we would start from a point where everybody knows what we're talking about and we're on the same page with each other.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, just wonderful to be here with you, Sarah, and have this conversation with you, somebody who's taught me a lot about this subject. So, the way I've been thinking about Christian nationalism lately is Christian nationalism is a desire to privilege a Christian person, Christian community in the United States in any way, economically, politically, socially. So one of the things that I like to do is I imagine a big table, and here we are sitting around the table as Americans, and we have folks who are atheists, folks who are agnostic, folks who are Jewish, folks who are Hindu, folks who are Buddhist, and so on and so forth. And a Christian person sits down and says, look, we're here, we're in the United States, and by dint of me being a Christian, I just get a different place than all of you. Now, I can justify that because the founders supposedly said this was a Christian nation, and that's how they designed it. So it's not that you have to leave. It's not that you can't be here. It's just, for the most part, I'm going to always have a different place in the country than you. So when we sit around the table, I am going to be superior. And all of you will be second-class citizens in some way. Now, that's a sort of simple image to conjure, but it really kind of provides us a way to think about the ways that a Christian nationalist shows up in the public square and says, by way of my identity, the story that I tell about myself, the story I tell about my country, I am inheriting the founding. I am going to be the one who's chosen to carry the country into its future. And everyone else just needs to recognize their place in the country and where they fit in the social order. So to me, Christian nationalism is an attempt to say that because I'm a Christian, I get a different place in the nation than everybody else. There's so much more to add to that, but I mean, how does that sound to you, Sarah? And where do you want to take that definition from there?
Okay, that's an interesting definition. I would define it differently because I'm a political reporter. So I think the way I look at it is more from a political perspective. And Christian nationalism, I look at it more as a political movement as opposed to the individual thinking of its proponents or adherents. And I think of it as a political movement which holds that God intended America to be a Christian nation, and that various changes, particularly in the 20th and 21st century, social changes, political changes, cultural changes, have caused America to stray from this God-ordained Christian founding, and that it is the religious and patriotic duty of Christian Americans to engage in both spiritual warfare and political action to restore America's Christian heritage. And so that's how I think of Christian nationalism. And I think that your definition is also an interesting starting point so that people can understand what is going through the mind of someone who is a Christian nationalist. Now, that leads me to my next question, which is a lot of people who you or I might consider to be a Christian nationalist would deny the label.
Yep.
And I think that the label has been controversial both inside and outside, let's call it the Christian right or evangelicalism, because it's a label that I think, unlike the word evangelical or Christian or conservative Christian, or even the term the Christian right, it's not a label that what we think of the adherents as, it's not a label that they would accept or embrace, with the exception of maybe Marjorie Taylor Greene. So given that, I mean, I guess another question that I have is, how do you think that Christian nationalism recently came into more common usage when in the past we would talk about the Christian right, we would talk about evangelicalism, we would talk about conservative Christians or even social conservatives, a term that I don't never loved because I didn't think it was quite on point. So maybe help us understand, because I'm not sure that I completely understand how Christian nationalism came to be used more frequently and more regularly, I would say, like in the Trump era, than it had been used before,
Yeah.
and why you think it might be a better term or a more accurate term than evangelical or conservative evangelical or even the Christian right or the religious right.
So I want to say first, I definitely agree with your definition. There's nothing in the way that you define Christian nationalism that strikes me as dissonant with how I think about it. And in fact, when I go back to my table and I think about that Christian telling everybody else in the country, by dint of me being a Christian, I get a different place. Oftentimes, the people around the table are going to say, I disagree. And so the Christian then is called into what? Spiritual warfare and action, whether democratic or not, whether legal or not, to restore the country and the round table I'm talking about to what it should be, right? So when I hear you talking about Christian nationalism as a political movement to restore the America to what it should be, I'm thinking of that Christian around the table saying, well, you all aren't listening. So now I got to do some things that, may be legal, maybe not be legal, maybe violent, maybe seem like they're not totally up to speed with, how we think of democratic norms in the country, but you forced my hand because you won't listen, right? So I just wanted to put that out there. I think that leads to this whole discussion of Christian nationalism as a term. And so the reason that I think Christian nationalism is a useful term is this. When you ask people on surveys these kinds of questions, should the United States be a Christian nation? Should the federal government declare this a Christian nation? Should the federal government adopt policies according to Christian values? If people are answering yes to those kinds of questions, if they're answering questions, yes to the question, should Christians have dominion over every aspect of American society? Then I think we need a term for those people, right? If you're going to show up and answer yes to the sociologist asking you the question, should America declare this a Christian nation? And you're like, you should. We have to call you something. We need a category. We need a label. At the moment, that label is Christian nationalist. And I think it's a good term for a couple of reasons. I think when people think about the religious right, going back to Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and those folks, the image that most people conjure is of Protestant Baptist men, some of them charismatic or nondescript evangelical. Rarely do people think of Catholics. Rarely do people think of Latter-day Saints. And I think what Christian nationalism does is allow us to say, look, if you fit the description that you and I used at the beginning here of somebody participating in an effort to restore the country to its Christian founding by way of spiritual warfare, by way of cosmic battle, if you think that as a Christian, you're inheriting the founding of the country and you are the real American, then you're a Christian nationalist in my mind. Now, you may not call yourself that, but this is what we do as like journalists and academics, isn't it? We find categories that help us understand people's identities and people's political motives and political actions. And Christian nationalism, at least in the moment, this current political moment, allows me to think of those who would don that identity, who would tell that story, and who would take action in the ways we're talking about that are not just limited to those Baptist Protestants and the Jerry Falwell types. There are so many Christian nationalists in the country, as you are well aware, who are Catholic, who are Orthodox. I was just in Utah talking to folks about Latter-day Saints and deep resonances and deep echoes of Christian nationalism in Mormon communities. And so we also seen a resurgence or an ascendance, I guess I should say, of charismatic and Pentecostal communities in this whole conversation in ways that probably were not present back in the 70s or 80s, at least in the mainstream, at least in the White House, like we see today, and so on. So for me, that's why Christian nationalism is the term we use today. Is it perfect? No. And when somebody says, well, nobody uses that term at my megachurch, so it's obviously not real, I'll be honest. If I show up at a dinner party and I say to somebody, hey, I listened to your story and that sounds really xenophobic. You sound like a bigot. Most people don't say, you're right, because I'm a bigot. So Thanks for noticing. You know, we all know the conversation stopper. If you call somebody a racist, they're going to say, "Of course, I can't believe you would say that. I can't, right?" And so that doesn't prevent me from calling people who are prejudicial or racist or bigots or so on. So I think Christian nationalism is a term that we can use, even if folks in those communities don't necessarily like it, or aren't necessarily self-identifying that way. It doesn't invalidate it as a term. So anyway, how do you see it? My guess is you disagree with me on this, and I'm wondering what you're thinking.
Well, I have to say that as a journalist, I don't love I'm fine with the phrase Christian nationalism as descriptive of a movement. And Christian nationalist ideas. Obviously, like I've used Christian nationalists and Christian nationalism in stories. It's in the subtitle of the paperback edition of my book. But I guess a couple of the reasons why I've been a little bit, I don't want to say, I guess I don't even want to say reticent, that's too strong, but I've been a little questioning about it because when I feel like if I use the term evangelical or conservative Catholic or whatever the term I use in my writing is, it's very descriptive. And it's also a description that my subjects would not disagree with. I mean, if you're writing about somebody who's evangelical, they're not going to say, I'm not an evangelical. And so, but on the other hand, like obviously, like Christian nationalist ideas, like we have a strong definition of what Christian nationalist ideas are. And so as a journalist, I'm not totally comfortable using a description of a person that they are not adhering to. Now, obviously, like I've done that. I've written about white supremacists, and they might say, I'm not a non-white supremacist, but, like it's pretty clear they're a white supremacist. And so I tend to use it more for, people who are in a leadership position and espousing Christian nationalist ideas. Like I've written about Mike Johnson, for example, the House Speaker, and he definitely espouses Christian nationalist ideas. So there's that piece of it as, the journalist me. And then I also wasn't, I felt like I live in this world. I've reported on this world for 20 years. I know it well. And I felt like it sort of crept up on me that all of a sudden Christian nationalist became the term that everybody was using, and editors wanted me to write stories about Christian nationalism. And so part of me was like, well, isn't that like, it's what I've been writing about.
Yeah,
It's
totally.
not new. And so one of the things, since you're the scholar, you're plugged into the sociologist world, the people who've been doing all this surveys and survey data and developing these definitions of Christian nationalism. So how do you think it was that the sociologists sort of pushed this into the mainstream discourse, particularly because it happened in the Trump era?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think everything you're saying there about like, hey, you've been writing about this for 20 years and the term changed, but the phenomenon it just seems to be a different label for the same phenomenon, right?
Exactly.
And I totally get it, and I agree. Um, I think a big moment came in the Trump era when we heard all about restoring a Christian nation and restoring Christian America. I think for a lot of people, and there's sociological data that backs this up, Make America Great Again was in some ways a way to say make America great by making it Christian again.
Right.
And then I think there was this recognition on the part of sociologists that the folks they were calling Christian nationalists were donning a cultural identity, right? They were not donning a set of theological beliefs that necessarily were different from other Americans who maybe had much different politics, right? So I think the best example of this is there's many Black Protestants who line up with many white evangelicals on like theological surveys. If you ask them about God and Jesus and the Bible, they look like theological like counterparts. And then you look at like how they vote and how they feel about like the realities of police brutality in the country, or how they think about immigration or the social safety net, and they could not be more different. And so I think for me, Christian nationalism caught on because it said, this is a cultural identity that is a helpful predictor for support for Trump, for the ways that people think about immigration or reproductive rights or gun control or gay marriage, right? This is a whole kind of like portfolio of political positions. And one of the best predictors is, do you think this is and should be a Christian nation? And so one of the things I tell my students is that Christian nationalism as a cultural identity does not mean you go to church 3 times a week. Like,
Right.
it does not mean you read the Bible every day. There are so many folks in the world who would say America was founded as a Christian nation, and if we got back to that, it would be way better. And I can't believe all these folks, the woke globalists and the Black Lives Matter and all the secularists who are trying to ruin everything. And you say, that's great, Greg. Wonderful. What church do you go to? And Greg says, I haven't been to church in a long time, but I know that this is what the country needs. And all of a sudden you realize you're telling a story about the country and yourself. It's a Christian story, and yet you're not somebody who's definitely doing Christian things on a regular, like, daily basis. And so I think sociologically, Christian nationalism came to be a kind of way to describe this larger phenomenon that maybe transcends the religious right. If I think of the religious right, I think of Jerry Falwell showing up with a Bible in his hand and trying to sort of legislate it all over the place. And I think Christian nationalism gathers something that's a little bigger than that. But again, I'm wondering how that strikes you, and wondering, where we agree and where we might disagree on this.
Right. So I think that from where I sit, changes happened in evangelicalism that caused the religious right to look different to us.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I think of it more that way than Christian nationalism is more prominent or exhibiting itself in different ways. But I think we're really talking about the same thing. I think maybe we're just thinking about the cause and effect of the language usage a little differently.
Yeah.
But from where I sit, so the religious right was a movement that, so like when obviously there were other previous iterations of the Christian right. I'm talking about the movement that came to be in the late 1970s. And it was really a joining together of Catholics and evangelicals. Paul Weyrich, the notorious political activist who dreamed up these alliances, was himself a Catholic, although at some point in his life, he decided that Vatican II was way too liberal for him, and he joined an Eastern Rite church. But he was a Catholic and believed in this alliance of evangelicals and Catholics to form this movement that we now know as the religious right. But I think over that period, so he starts to talk to Jerry Falwell and his people, in the late 70s, and then they form the Moral Majority in 1979, and you have the Council for National Policy and the Heritage Foundation and the formation of all these. Even if they're not inside the Beltway, they're intended to influence politics inside the Beltway organizations. And later, the Family Research Council and all of these organizations that are now essentially household names. I think over that same period from then to now, starting in the early 1970s with the advent of Christian television, Trinity Broadcasting Network, the Christian Broadcasting Network, later Daystar and others, that you saw this proliferation of charismatic Christian ideas and the really explosive growth of charismatic and Pentecostal Christianity. And that covered that period from the founding of the Moral Majority until now. And like maybe, Jerry Falwell, who started out as an independent fundamental Baptist and became a Southern Baptist of convenience, didn't really dig all of the charismatic worship practices like speaking in tongues and all of that. That was really the movement that was growing within evangelicalism. And that's a movement that very much focuses on spiritual occurrences, signs, wonders, miracles, spiritual warfare, direct revelation from God, prophecy, and all of that. And so it becomes a movement that's less grounded perhaps in the actual politics that the religious right started out wanting to engage in, and much more grounded in this idea of spiritual warfare. And so I think that when we see the evolution of this movement into a movement that is in the thrall of Donald Trump, that to me explains a lot of it.
And I think what's interesting about that is that that kind of growth you're talking about of the charismatic influence, it doesn't mean that the politics changed, right? Because if we
Right.
look at 2015, 16, some of the most ardent anti-abortion Christian activists in the country come from that Pentecostal charismatic
Absolutely.
world, right?
Absolutely.
When, you know, when
Yes.
we think about like the Appeal to Heaven flag and Dutch Sheets, who really popularized that, in which Samuel Alito recently, it was discovered he's been flying it over his summer residence. The Appeal to Heaven flag in 2015, when Dutch Sheets is talking about the Appeal to Heaven, he's talking about how America's not done yet because we're going to overturn Roe, and we're not gonna let Oberfell and gay marriage be the law of the land. Like, they are still on the same political train in terms of
Exactly.
anti-abortion,
Yes.
anti-gay rights, anti-queer rights, and so on and so forth. So, you know, yeah, it's a continuation in that sense. But I totally take your point about it. It looks different. I mean, the idea that Paula White Cain would be the spiritual advisor to Donald Trump, who's a female pastor, a female leader, and somebody who comes from, I mean, plenty of videos of her speaking in tongues, right, all over the internet. And so I think Billy Graham would have thought this was not possible. I think Jerry Falwell was thinking, no, that's not what we want. Nonetheless, when you have access to power, everybody gets on board and they find a way to work together, which is what they did.
Yes, and I think another really important feature of what you were just saying is that, the Southern Baptist Convention, which was at the core, at the heart of the formation of the religious right that got behind Ronald Reagan in 1980, they still do not allow women to preach from the
Yep.
pulpit,
Yep.
right? And so, like, in those days, it would have been not only super controversial for a woman to be preaching from the pulpit, but for the president of the United States to have a woman who preached from the pulpit be his top spiritual advisor.
Yeah.
It's like a little beyond the speaking in tongues and the prosperity gospel and all of that. Um, it is, kind of, it's remarkable. But I think that I'm glad you brought up Paula White, right? Because she is somebody who benefited from Christian television. Where would she be? She would
Yes.
not be
Yeah.
anybody today without Christian
Yeah.
TV. So
Yeah.
she brings her own, she's her career is helped by TD Jakes, who helps bring her to a broader audience and then to television.
Mhm.
And she kind of combines um, women's empowerment and, getting past trauma in your life, like sexual abuse and a difficult childhood, and brings that together with the prosperity gospel into this very, for her, lucrative, successful. She was an influencer before TikTok, right? Like, she
Totally.
was the
Totally.
influencer of Christian broadcasting. And the reason why you have her with Donald Trump is that he saw her on TV. The lore about their meeting was that he was in Florida, channel surfing, and he saw her and, asked to be introduced to her. And so that really is it's such a potent example of how Christian television spread this kind of charismatic Christianity far beyond the confines of charismatic Christianity, which I think also goes to your point of a lot of people who sociologists would identify as a Christian nationalist really came to it not necessarily by going to church or Bible study or
That's
even
right.
reading the Bible, but maybe saw it on TV, saw a meme on Twitter. Like, there are lots of ways that people can get that now. So when people say, how did the Christian right get behind Donald Trump, who's, never gone to church a day in his life and can't cite a Bible verse? Well, because they believe in signs and wonders and prophecy and signs from God. They think that it must have meant something that he saw Paula White on TV and they met, and that, God is signaling something through all of this, and then that snowballs into their claim that not only did God anoint Trump leader of America to restore this lost Christian America that they believe has been eroded by liberalism, feminism, LGBTQ rights, and the rest.
Mhm.
Um, they believe that, so like, it snowballs into he's anointed, it snowballs into well, like, how can he be anointed if he's not a Christian himself? It snowballs into then, sometimes God chooses an unlikely leader to lead a nation at a critical juncture in its history. And here we are, we're at a really critical juncture in our history. And so I think that if anyone thinks that that Christian nationalism is solely disseminated or even primarily disseminated at church, I think that that is a misapprehension of how ideas and memes spread in this culture.
I almost think that there's a lot of folks who realize they're a Christian by way of their politics. So I'll give you examples of like men I went to high school with, men who are in their 40s, who in high school and our youth had no interest in religion and Bible study. And I've seen them over the decades, right? I watch my old high school cohorts on Facebook, and they're really into right-wing politics surrounding patriarchy and the family. And you can tell which radio stations they're listening to. You can tell when they found Alex Jones. You can tell when
Mhm.
they found Charlie Kirk. And they're kind of, yeah, like immigration, I don't think so. Build that wall. And then they end up having, feelings about the queer community. And all of a sudden, like a couple months later, here come the Bible verses. And it's almost like they realized my conservative, patriarchal, uh, political leanings led me back to church. And they realized that being a Christian is like super symbiotic with everything they think they believe about the country. And so when they go to church, it's not that they were led there by a friend who asked them if they knew Jesus while they were, on their lunch break at work. A lot of the times it's Charlie Kirk. I agree with everything that guy says about politics and white people being the most hated class in America, and oh, the men got to be men, and he's all about Jesus. You know what? Yeah, I'm going to find a church that sounds like that. And to your point, you talk to pastors today, and they have a 45-minute sermon every week. And everybody in the audience has been listening to 4 hours of podcasts, 4 hours of YouTube channels, right? Their
Mhm.
favorite radio station, and whatever books they're reading,
And
and or
TikTok.
TikTok. TikTok. I was just gonna say, right? I don't want to sound like an old man. And all the TikToks they've been scrolling, and that adds up to about 20 hours of the week. And that pastor has a choice: either I line up politically with what they're already hearing from all those other voices in their ether, or I don't. And if I'm the one who doesn't fit, guess what? They're going to go find another church that will line up with those things. And so the choice is either get on board with the MAGA train and watch my church balloon, or don't, and maybe I don't have a job in a couple of months.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really interesting dynamic of that, of how pastors might have to yield to MAGA just in order to survive or
Yeah.
maintain their congregation. Well, there's also the interesting, I want to get to January 6th in a minute because we're here to talk about democracy too, right? But I just want to put out there, I remember that she was a participant in January 6th, and I don't remember her name. She was a real estate agent from
Oh,
Texas.
yeah.
And I remember after the news came out that of her role, I looked at her Facebook. And that day, or in the days leading up to it and after, she was posting a lot on her Facebook, just Bible verses, but they were all wrong. Like that wasn't actually like any translation of that Bible verse. And I just thought, like, to me, that was like such a like potent example of how a lot of people are sort of latching on to this idea of being, you know, a patriotic Christian, or what they believe, a MAGA Christian, but that they don't even have the Bible part right. And then there was the other component of the polling data that showed that more people started to identify as evangelical during Trump's presidency than
Yep.
did before his
Yep.
presidency, which is interesting and weird. But I do want to get to January 6th,
Okay.
but I wanted to maybe enter into that conversation by talking to you about your book. Because in your book, you talk about your own experience in high school going to an evangelical church, something you chose as opposed to, your parents made you go to church. And I thought it would be a really good way of getting people to understand what the draw is, because I think a lot of people who aren't in this world or immersed in this world have a hard time understanding what it is that is the draw. Now, now that the draw for a lot of people is Trump and is MAGA, right?
Yeah.
But you were in high school. I don't remember the dates that you were in high school, um, but but I think that your own life experience with
Yeah.
this gives an insight into that I think is really important for people to understand.
Yeah. So I entered high school in the 90s, mid 90s, and I was, I was a 14-year-old kid getting in
And,
trouble.
let's put some context on this. This is in Southern California.
Southern California. I grew up near Anaheim, California. So I grew up in what many Southern Californians consider the Bible Belt. A lot of folks don't realize that Orange
Yeah.
County, the famous Orange County that people always hear about and make fun of, is really a Bible Belt. And up until
Yes, Rick
recently was
Warren.
it, yes, Rick Warren, the Crystal Cathedral,
Mhm.
Biola University, James Dobson started Focus on the Family 20 minutes up the road from where I grew up. So there's just a lot of history in Southern California in terms of evangelicalism. And, Lisa McGurr, the Harvard historian, calls Orange County the epicenter of mid-20th century American conservatism. This
Yes.
was Barry Goldwater country. My church that I grew up in, or at least converted to when I was 14, was Richard Nixon's church. So when Richard Nixon was a young man, this is the church he went to. His parents actually helped start it. This is the place where we named our airport after John Wayne. This is the political birthplace in some ways of Ronald Reagan. So like this is the
It was
water I
Colorado
grew up around.
Springs before Colorado Springs was Colorado Springs.
Oh, for sure. Like, Colorado, we consider Colorado Springs to be the kind of copycat. Like, all
Yeah.
right, you all have the money and the power now, but go back to the 60s and 70s and 80s and you look at the makeup of Orange County and it was all Southerners and Midwesterners who'd migrated there for jobs. So the point is, when I converted a mega church that's 90% white. So here I am, a biracial teenage kid, and I'm a juvenile delinquent. I'm getting in trouble. My family life is good, but it's also vexing me and giving me angst. And here's what evangelicalism offers me that I want to get across to everybody. It offers you community in ways that you may not have had before. You're invited into this big group of thousands of folks who are going to go to summer camp and have a bonfire at the beach and welcome you to a Bible study and want you to be part of everything they're doing. They're going to offer you answers to the meaning of life that require no long division. There's no like year-long catechesis. There's no years-long, like decades of meditation to reach some sort of spiritual enlightenment. It's simply, do you accept Christ into your heart? Will you ask for forgiveness? And if you do, you'll be given eternal life and you'll have a chance to be part of this story. The final part of it is, and I think this is still true today, you're invited into an epic narrative. So like I went from being a 14-year-old kid, kind of not sure of who he was in the world, wrestling with his racial identity, wrestling with himself and puberty and adolescence and all those things we all go through. And I ended up invited into the end times, the last chapter of the planet Earth, a cosmic battle between good and evil. I can be like part of that. Like this is like Lord of the Rings or a grand epic, but not the first iteration. Like this is the final battle. Like we're at the final boss, the big bad enemy that has to be defeated for things to get back to how they should be, right? And I'm going to be part of that.
So
That is
what were
so
you,
alluring.
yes. And what were you taught was the big bad enemy in the 90s? I mean, I know in Southern California, before then, communism was the
Yep.
big bad enemy, but we're talking about after the fall of communism that you were in high school and attending this church. And so how were you taught to conceive of an enemy? And was it not just an enemy of yours, but an enemy of America?
It was always an enemy of America. So we still had strong anti-communist feelings about the Soviet Union, even in the mid 90s, right? So we're still being taught communism is godless. Communism is collectivist. We're Christian. We're capitalist. We're individualist. We do it the right way. That's how God wants it. And you know who's coming for us? The secular humanists.
Mhm.
The secular humanists who have a religion of worshiping themselves, and they want things that are anti-American. Those things include abortion. Those things include gay rights. Those things include women working outside of the home. Those things include overturning a social order that God has ordained. So what when I think of Christian nationalism, I think of a Christianity that I converted to, that was a conversion to a certain vision of America, that by becoming a Christian, I became a real American. And when I would look at folks, like when I would drive to church on a Sunday morning and see folks walking their dog, I think, if these folks got back in church, this country would get back on track. But also, when I went to see my Japanese American family an hour away in like downtown LA or parts of Los Angeles County, I thought, here's a bunch of Japanese people who are Buddhist. They don't know God. This is a problem. My real identity is over there in church. And so what happened is I started to view my Japanese American family as less than American, as because they were not Christian. I started to see them as other internally. And all of a sudden, all of these pathways of internalized racism and othering a religious family or a part of my family that's obviously so important to me come right into the forefront. That's why I always talk about a conversion to Christ and a conversion to the United States. We always had the American flag in our sanctuary when we worshiped without fail.
Mm-hmm. And so talk a little bit about how this also drew you into a particular kind of political activity.
There was no way to be Christian and to be Democrat. It just was unthinkable. And so the idea was, if you're a Christian, there are unassailable political positions that you will hold. You cannot be for abortion in any way, because if you are for abortion in any way, you are for murder, period. You cannot be for any form of family, marriage, love that is not between two heterosexual people, a man and a woman who are heterosexual. There's just no other way to conceive of that. It's really hard to think about anything but putting America first, because America has been chosen by God to play an exceptional role in history. Now, all of this came shattering into stark relief for me after 9/11 and during the Bush years. After 9/11, I remember I was like 20, 21 years old. And I remember telling a leader at the church, I was a minister by then, and he was a kind of elder minister than me. I was kind of junior, low person on the hierarchy. And I said, hey, we're going to have a big service commemorating everything that happened with 9/11. Do you think this is a chance for us as a congregation to think about the ways that terrorism, but also violence, affects people all over the world? Because this is unique for us, but this is something that people all over the world have experienced for a long time. And I don't want to downplay the hurt and the trauma of our nation. But do you think maybe this is a chance for us as a congregation for us to gain a kind of global view of the ways that there's so much pain in the world and so much hurt, and that for some people, this is an everyday occurrence? And he looked at me like I had just told him I wanted to shoot his dog or something. He looked at me like, how dare you? I just cannot believe you would suggest that. And then I told people I was voting for John Kerry. I cannot vote for George W. Bush a second time. I'm 23. I can think of my own now. And they all said, look, that's great. He wants to put more money in education. He's all for, various social reforms that would be more Christian. Good for you. That's cute. It's really cute. He's for abortion. Do you want to be responsible for the Holocaust of unborn babies? Because if you do, vote for him. If not, make the Christian choice.
Now, you use that word Holocaust, and I want to point out that this is very commonly used on the Christian right to describe what abortion is. You weren't just, throwing that out there. This is really commonly used.
It's used. It was used then, and it's still used today.
Correct.
And so go ahead, please. Sorry.
So your book is called Preparing for War, and it's really about how you, as a young person attending this church and immersing yourself, not just in the theology, but just in the entire culture of it, that you, looking back on it now, you see that you were being primed to be at war, at spiritual war, which they talk about a lot. But you say in the book that, had January 6th happened while you were still in this church, or if you were still in the church when January 6th, the actual January 6th happened, that you can't say for certain whether you would not have participated. And why do you think, or how do you think, that ideology of saving America from these enemies would become so strong that you would actually go to war with the government of America itself, that you would, that you would actually engage in an insurrection.
Yeah, when this part of my book comes up, people often think I just wrote that to kind of be tantalizing and for to sell books or something. So I'm just gonna prove it to you real quick, Sarah, and then I'll just so people buy what I'm selling here. When I was 16, my mom said, "What do you want for Christmas?" And she wasn't particularly religious, and I said, "You know, Mom, I don't want anything. How much money are you going to spend?" And she said, "Here, I don't know, this much." So I pulled out these pamphlets that I had in my backpack from school, and I said, "If you spend that much money on Bibles, we could probably send 50 to 100 Bibles to Nepal." And they've never heard of Jesus. So wouldn't that be great? And she looked at me like, "Oh man, I wish you were like still stinking out of the house and like trying to smoke pot at the park or something, because this is just getting weird." Um, and then I would spend my Friday nights with a friend at the movie theater. And when kids would come out our age, we would stop them and be like, "Hey, how are you? I'm Brad. Have you ever thought about where you're going to spend eternity?" And like, I'm 15. No one's making me do it. No one's like telling me I have, right? This is just like what I chose to do on a Friday night. There's a thing called See You at the Pole where Christian teenagers pray once a year. I decided
At
that
public
wasn't good
schools.
enough
I
at
just
public
want to point
schools.
out, at public schools.
So you show up at your school at like 6:30 a.m. and you pray. It's a big public showing of your faith, and you pray at the flagpole.
Mhm.
And I decided that wasn't good enough. So I prayed every Friday at the flagpole. So a lot of times I'd just be out there by myself at like 6:30 a.m. And like this dude on the basketball team was like, "Hey, why were you praying to the flag?" And I was like, "Well, I never thought about it that way. I wasn't. I was praying for God to return our country to where it should be." Here's my point is I took so seriously, Sarah, that I was part of a cosmic narrative, a battle for good and evil. And I was wanting to participate in that, even if it meant being awkward or strange or just everybody around me not getting it. And so if you would have told me that there are forces who are trying to take down a government and a nation that is trying to restore godly civil rule in the world, and that these are demonic forces displacing a God-chosen candidate from his rightful place as our leader. And our only recourse is for us, the spiritual warriors, to show up, to pray, to be present, and to do what God needs us to do. 20-year-old me, if you would have said, "Hey, Brad, here's a plane ticket. You coming?"
Mhm.
There's a very good chance I would have said yes.
Okay. So, I mean, I think that's a really fascinating, insight into the thinking. And I think that's something that's not well understood about January 6th. And I think part of the reason why it's not well understood about January 6th is the January 6th committee, while they did amazing work in literally every other facet of January 6th, that they did not at all address the Christian iconography and the role that the Christian right played in laying a lot of the groundwork for what happened on January 6th. And I want to I want to return to, some of the things you were saying earlier and just a few minutes ago, to talk about, things like the Jericho March, which was a prayer event that was organized, to be for and by both Catholics and evangelicals. They had this big rally on the mall, on the National Mall, sorry, on the National Mall in December after the election, insisting that Trump had won and that
Mhm.
God was going to turn the whole thing around, right? And that
Yep.
they imagined themselves, or they portrayed themselves as being like Joshua's army, coming to the walls of Jericho, and their trumpet sound would make the walls of the deep state, like the deep state was the stand-in for Jericho in the Bible story, come tumbling down, and Trump would be president. Um, and I think, you look at the survey data now, and which religious demographic most likely believes that Joe Biden is not the legitimate president of the United States: white evangelicals. So, I think this notion that we were talking earlier about, like the influence of this charismatic Christianity thinking, the
Mhm.
prophecy, the spiritual warfare, the direct revelations from God, has really played a role in this kind of anti-democratic, pro-Trump, anti-democratic small d thinking,
Hmm.
right? So
Hmm.
like if you believe that God anointed the leader, even though he seems unlikely to be the leader because he's not really even a Christian, right? But if you believe that God anointed this leader to lead America at this critical juncture in its history, of course you're going to
Yeah.
believe that the election was rigged
Yeah.
and that Joe Biden isn't the, Joe Biden really isn't the legitimate president. The whole thing was stolen from Trump, and that this has to be avenged in 2024. I don't see really any other way of thinking about the framework that the people who were involved in the Jericho March, they had the big event on the National Mall in December, but they also had a prayer event in the days leading up to and on January 6th.
Yeah.
Not as large, but they were there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, can you talk about that a little bit and talk about it from your vantage point as somebody who, you know, except for the grace of God, might have been there?
Well, I think that, everything you said there, one of the things about the charismatic influence we keep talking about is, for me as a teenager, I definitely had friends who were part of that charismatic world. And when they would tell me about speaking in tongues, or they would talk to me about healings, that invitation into an epic narrative only got more tantalizing, because now you're thinking, wait, you mean like Bible times? Like somebody's leg was healed? You mean like
Hmm.
Bible times somebody was filled with the Holy Spirit, that they spoke in tongues? So I think when you think about it that way, it really brings people into the narrative in a heightened manner. They expect supernatural occurrences. Now, that worldview also includes, as you've been talking about all day today, a spiritual warfare motif that says we have to pray, we have to act for the good, for light, for God's army to win. It's an invitation to an open-ended conflict, right? And so if that's the case, you showing up makes a difference. It is not foreordained that if the prayer warriors, if the godly ordained people are willing to get out there on the ground and dislodge the demons that are holding the United States Capitol captive, if they're willing to dislodge the principalities in the hearts of our leaders, if they're willing to march around not just the United States Capitol, but the swing state capitals, and
Hmm.
dislodge spiritually everything holding us back and Satan's plans, then we will win. So when you look ahead to 2024, that has only grown. I mean, I think you and I have talked about this over the years, but January 6th was not the end, right? January 6th was the beginning of this revenge tour, this sense of like, we will win. We will be in power. We will win this war. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. And so like, if you look at whether you look at data, whether you look at the discourse from communities, the idea that 2024 is a reckoning, it's to me way worse than it was in 2020, as we led up to that election. I mean, I'm happy for you to disagree with me, and you may, I totally understand if you have a different perspective on that, but that's how it feels to me, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I, we should wrap this up for
Sure.
time, but
Yeah.
I want to leave maybe on a more positive note. I mean, I do think that from a political standpoint, I do think that there are figures in the religious right who are worried about their image going forward.
Hmm.
Should you know let's say that Trump loses and the loss sticks, that there isn't like an intervention by either the House or the Supreme Court to install him in office. And, in normal political times, that is, without Trump, the religious right would have to work a little harder because, like, they're not a majority. Like, they're
No.
this very powerful, outsized, this minority with an outsized power in our country because they play such an enormous outsized role in Republican politics. They therefore because of the asymmetries of the electoral college and the Senate and all of that, and gerrymandering and all of that, they play an outsized role in our politics. But they do at some point have to think about the politics of this. Trump's not going to live forever. So I do think that there's some concern. You saw that in the pushback coming really first from the religious right against Marjorie Taylor Greene's efforts to oust Mike Johnson, right?
Yeah.
I
Hmm.
don't deny that in the base, the revenge tour for Trump is definitely there. But I do think that 2024 is going to be a little bit different from the standpoint that Trump won't be president. He won't be the incumbent. So I think it would be harder for him to muster the mechanics of it, let's say. And, you know, given that the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, many of them are in jail now, you know, I mean, you would think that at least some people that would give them a little pause before going forward. But in terms of the spirit, you know, if you're just like into that spiritual warfare and denying the facts right in front of you, denying that Biden won this, you know, precinct or won this state, I think we're going to have a lot of that. And we're going to have a lot of bad faith litigation and all of that. I do think it's all going to look a little bit different from 2020 and 2021. I just don't know in what ways, and you know, but I mean it's incredibly vexing because our democracy is at stake, not just like, you know, democracy itself, the future of our country and what it's going to look like. So I think that people need to be aware of that. What we're dealing with is very much a movement that's not susceptible to reason and facts.
I agree. And I think we could have spent the entire day today talking about things like Project 2025 and the
Absolutely.
ways that,
Yes.
you know, Trump and those around him have projected what his next term would look like. It is heavily fueled by Christian nationalists. So if you look at the sponsors of Project 2025, it's Liberty University, it is Hillsdale College,
yeah,
right? TPUSA, and the Heritage Foundation, of course, was founded by a rad trad Christian nationalist named Paul Weyrich. And so I guess for me, we already know what they want. And I agree that democracy is not it. And I guess that's the thing I'll leave people with is there is hope. There's so many reasons in terms of the ways people have voted over the last 2 years, the off-cycle elections, the ways that reproductive rights have just sustained a priority in the American mindset, and young people and everyone else have voted to protect them in Kansas and Arizona and other places. Nonetheless, this is really an election that is about the future of American democracy, as trite and as cliche as that sounds now, because it seems as if that's the line that everybody touts. But I don't really know how else to say it, given everything that you and I have talked about today, all that you and I research, all the ways that we're in this day in and day out. It's never become less clear to me that that's what this election is. On a daily basis, it just becomes more and more clear that's what's at stake.
Right. And I think also the other thing to keep in mind, lest people think that this is solely a movement of people who are denying reality, is that inside the Beltway and inside these organizations like the Heritage Foundation, there are people who are hard at work crafting policy ideas, ideas for lawsuits and litigation and all the rest, what they would do once placed in a political appointment or a judgeship or whatever under Trump. And it's all anti-democratic as well. So you have these two things working in tandem, where you have the base who is like believing in all this supernatural spiritual warfare stuff and denying the reality of election results. That's helping to buttress and support the policy wonks and the lawyers and the legal advocates who are going to make the policy stuff happen. And so this is like a very dangerous combination, because they're both aiming at democracy, but in different ways. Undermining election results and the peaceful transfer of power, you know, and tied together with an entire like policy and legal infrastructure that's going to put in place all of these, you know, things to strip away people's rights and undermine separation of church and state and the rest. So if you care about those things, you should vote.
Can I just say one thing? And that is, if you want to know the authoritarian spirit and commitment behind everything Sarah just said, your book is the best resource out there on that. Like, your book, Unholy, shows us the history of the authoritarianism of this movement in such clear manner that there's no better resource for that. So I've read the book a million times, and I've talked about it a million times, and I'm going to talk about it one more time. So yeah.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your book. And thank you for this great discussion today.
Thank you.